At 9:17 a.m. on January 22nd, 1943, 2nd Lieutenant John George lay hidden inside the shattered remains of a Japanese bunker on Point Cruz, Guadalcanal. The concrete was cracked, the jungle heat pressed against his skin, and from somewhere beyond the tree line, the low thump of American artillery rolled like distant thunder. George ignored all of it. His eyes were fixed through a scope his fellow officers had mocked for weeks. A mail-order sporting optic mounted on a civilian rifle no one believed in. He steadied his breath, slow and controlled, while the jungle hissed around him. Cicadas screamed, leaves dripped. In the thick humidity, even sound felt heavy. 240 yards away, a banyan tree towered over the grove, one of dozens where Japanese snipers had killed 14 Americans in just 3 days. George scanned its branches again. Then it happened. A single limb shifted. No wind, no breeze, just movement. The kind only a trained eye would notice. And by sundown, 11 sniper positions would fall because of the rifle everyone laughed at. This is how a mail-order Winchester outshot the Empire of Japan. John George was 27 years old, soft-spoken, and built more like a college athlete than a soldier. Before the war, he had won the Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards, the youngest man ever to do it. He could group shots with iron sights tighter than most men could with scopes. But here, on Guadalcanal, none of that mattered, because for all his skill, George had 0 combat kills, and his one advantage, the rifle he trusted more than anything, wasn't even supposed to be here. 6 weeks earlier, while his battalion shipped out from Tennessee, George's prized Winchester Model 70 sat in a warehouse back in the States. A sporting rifle, civilian, bolt action. He had saved 2 years of National Guard pay to buy it. He mailed the army repeatedly, begging them to forward it to the Pacific. When the crate finally arrived, the supply sergeant laughed. A wooden box labeled "Fragile." Inside, a polished Model 70 with a Lyman Alaskan scope and custom mounts George had fitted himself. To him, it was a precision tool. To everyone else, it was a joke. Officers joked it looked like something ordered from the back of a hunting magazine. One platoon leader called it his mail-order sweetheart. Captain Morris, his company commander, told him, "Leave the toy in your tent and carry a real rifle." But the timing could not have been worse for mockery. The Marines had fought here since August. They had held Henderson Field, but the Japanese were still dug in across the island, especially in the groves near Point Cruz. And in those groves, hidden in banyan trees, thick enough to swallow a man whole, Japanese snipers were killing Americans faster than malaria. 14 men dead in 72 hours. Patrols were terrified to move. Supply routes became death traps. Something had to be done. On the night of January 21st, the battalion commander summoned George. He pointed at the Winchester sitting across George's knees. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "you're going to prove whether that thing is a hobby or a weapon that can save lives." George nodded. He didn't argue. He just cleaned his rifle, checked every screw on the scope mount, and waited for dawn. The groves west of Point Cruz looked peaceful from a distance. Rows of coconut palms, thick ferns, and towering banyan trees rising like pillars into the canopy. But the men of the 132nd Infantry knew better. Those groves were a killing ground. The banyans were monstrous things. Trunks 8 feet thick, roots twisting like ropes, branches stretching nearly 100 feet above the jungle floor. Inside those branches, Japanese snipers built nests invisible to the naked eye. A man could climb up before dawn, settle into the crook of two limbs, and remain motionless until nightfall. No sound, no movement, no warning. This was their world, not America's. Japanese sniper doctrine was built on patience. Pairs of marksmen worked together, one shooter, one spotter, both trained to hold still for hours, waiting for the smallest mistake. And after 3 days of deadly hits on American patrols, they believed they were untouchable. John George intended to prove otherwise. At first light on January 22nd, George slipped into the ruins of an old Japanese bunker overlooking the groves. He brought no spotter, no radio man, no backup team, just his Winchester, 60 rounds of ammunition, a canteen, and the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly what his rifle could do. Inside the bunker, the air was thick. Humidity clung to his skin. His breath fogged the scope's glass every few minutes. Insects crawled across broken concrete, buzzing loud enough to mask movement in the trees. George ignored everything except the banyans. He scanned each one methodically, top to bottom, left to right, just as he had practiced on firing ranges back home. Then again, nothing. The groves were alive with sound, birds, insects, distant artillery, but nothing moved in the branches. George filtered out the noise, learning to see only what didn't belong. Minutes passed, then more. And at 9:17 a.m., something finally changed. A single branch, high in a banyan, nearly 200 yards away, shifted, just slightly. No wind, no breeze, just movement. The kind of movement only a sniper would make. George adjusted the focus of his scope. His hunt had officially begun. George steadied the rifle, letting the crosshairs settle on the small shadow tucked between the banyan's thick branches. The shape hadn't moved again, not even a twitch. That was the giveaway. Only trained snipers froze like statues. George exhaled slowly, the same way he had during competitions back in Illinois. 2 clicks right for wind, 1 click up for distance. Then he squeezed. The Winchester barked, sharp, clean, unmistakable. 240 yards away, the shape jerked. The Japanese sniper toppled from his perch and dropped nearly 90 feet, crashing through branches before hitting the jungle floor with a dull thud. First shot, first kill. George worked the bolt smoothly and stayed on the scope. He knew Japanese doctrine. Snipers rarely worked alone. And sure enough, movement flickered in another banyan 40 yards north. A second sniper, lower in the canopy, climbing down fast, retreating. George led the shot ahead of the man's movement, calculated the angle, and fired. The second sniper fell backward off the trunk, his rifle bouncing through the branches after him. 2 shots, 2 kills. The groves, for the first time in days, fell silent. George reloaded from a stripper clip. His breathing remained slow, steady, disciplined. This wasn't adrenaline, it was execution. At 11:21 a.m., the jungle reminded him the enemy was learning too. A rifle cracked from the southwest. The bullet slammed into a sandbag 6 inches from George's head, spraying dirt into his eyes. He rolled sideways, pressing against the bunker wall as another shot tore through the vines above him. This sniper was patient, smart, skilled. George waited 3 long minutes before returning to his firing position. He scanned slowly, methodically, until he spotted it. A dark silhouette positioned 70 feet up a banyan, nestled among 5 intertwined trunks. The enemy had chosen a different angle, a different tree, but he hadn't moved far enough. George steadied the Winchester, let the crosshairs breathe with him, and fired. The third sniper slumped forward and dropped silently into the branches. 3 shots, 3 kills, and the grove was suddenly a much more dangerous place for everyone. By noon, word had already spread through the battalion like wildfire. The quiet lieutenant with the toy rifle had dropped 3 Japanese snipers before lunch. Men who had laughed at his mail-order scope were now asking where he was positioned, wanting to watch him work. George refused. Spectators drew attention, attention drew fire, and the Japanese were already adjusting. By early afternoon, their snipers stopped moving altogether. No quick shifts, no climbing, no obvious silhouettes. George scanned for hours without seeing a single mistake. It was clear. His opening shots had shaken them. At 3:57 p.m., they answered. A deep thump rolled across the jungle. Then another. Then 3 more. Mortars. The Japanese had triangulated his position from sound alone. The first salvo landed 40 yards short, tight grouping, dangerously accurate. The second landed 20 yards short, blasting ferns and tearing bark from the trees. The third would hit the bunker. George didn't hesitate. He grabbed the Winchester, his ammunition, and sprinted north along the tree line. Behind him, the bunker he'd occupied hours before vanished in a roar of dirt and shattered concrete. He dropped into a shell crater, caught his breath, then moved again, staying low, staying silent. 120 yards north, he found a fallen tree with a clear view back into the groves. Good cover, better angles. George settled in. Minutes later, a faint flicker in the canopy gave away kill number 4. A sniper shifting ever so slightly when the sun angle betrayed his shadow. 1 shot. 4th kill. Another shape appeared near the edge of the grove. Thinking the mortars had flushed George out completely, he exposed just enough of his shoulder. George squeezed. 5th kill. The jungle was no longer just terrain. It had become a chessboard. Every move George made forced the Japanese to adjust. Every move they made forced George to read their intent, their doctrine, their fear. The opening shots had been target practice. Now it was a duel. Daybreak on January 23rd came with a curtain of heavy tropical rain, the kind that swallowed sound and turned the jungle into a grey dripping maze. For snipers, rain was opportunity. It hid movement. It masked mistakes. George used it. Instead of returning to the fallen tree, he shifted positions in silence, moving 70 yards south to a cluster of rocks the Marines had once used as a machine gun nest. Good elevation, good cover, and most importantly, unexpected. He settled in as the rain softened to a drizzle. By 9:12 a.m., visibility had returned. Enough to hunt. George scanned the groves again. Slow, patient arcs of the scope. Then he saw it. A Japanese sniper sitting low in a palm tree, barely 40 feet up. No concealment, no camouflage, just a dark figure tucked behind 2 drooping fronds. It was too easy, too obvious. George froze. Snipers of this caliber didn't make beginner mistakes. For the last 24 hours, Japanese shooters had demonstrated discipline, patience, and deadly accuracy. This man was bait. George lowered the rifle slightly and widened his search pattern. If the palm tree sniper was the lure, the real threat had to be somewhere with a clear line of fire on George's previous position. 11 minutes passed. Nothing moved. Then, finally, he found it. 91 feet up a towering banyan tree wrapped in branches and vines, a second sniper sat perfectly hidden. A real professional, watching the fallen tree, waiting for George to reveal himself. or take the easy kill. George understood the trap instantly, so he used it. He aimed at the bait in the palm tree first, not because that sniper mattered, but because the sound of the shot would make the real shooter react. One smooth breath, one squeeze. The bait sniper jerked and fell. At the sound, the sniper in the banyan tree shifted. Just a slight turn, just enough for a trained eye to catch movement in the canopy. George swung the rifle, crosshairs landing exactly where the silhouette had begun to rotate. He fired. The second sniper tumbled from 90 feet up, crashing through branches. 2 shots, 2 kills, trap reversed. George grabbed his rifle and slid down behind the rocks. 6 seconds later, Japanese machine guns erupted, shredding the exact position where George had been lying moments before. Wood splintered, stone chipped, vines exploded in bursts of dirt. The Japanese weren't reacting anymore. They were hunting the hunter, and George was still one move ahead. By the next morning, the groves felt different, quieter, tighter, as if the jungle itself had shifted to watch him. George returned to his new position before dawn, settling into a shallow, muddy crater left by an old mortar blast. He kept low, letting the morning fog roll across the groves like drifting smoke. He expected the last Japanese sniper to be in the trees, high, concealed, unreachable. But at 9:47 a.m., he realized he was wrong. A flicker of movement appeared in the corner of his vision. On the ground, a dark shape crawled through the undergrowth, slow and deliberate, pushing vines aside inch by inch. Not climbing, not hiding, but stalking. The 11th sniper was doing something none of the others had dared. He was hunting on foot, using the jungle floor for cover, following the faint marks George had left near the rocks the day before. It was bold, it was dangerous, and it meant he wasn't alone. George scanned wider and spotted a second Japanese soldier farther back, using a fallen log as partial cover. A 2-man sweep, shooter and backup, moving in coordinated silence. They weren't looking up anymore. They were looking for George. He sank lower into the crater until muddy water reached his chin. He raised the Winchester vertically to keep the barrel clear and let only his eyes sit above the surface, still, unblinking, invisible in the shadowed water. The 2 Japanese soldiers crept closer. 40 yards, then 30. They whispered to each other in quick, sharp bursts of sound. They were tracking his route from the machine gun attack. The first soldier, the sniper, crawled past George's crater without realizing he was inches away from a man submerged like a crocodile. The second followed, sweeping his rifle slowly through the ferns. When both had their backs exposed, George moved. He rose from the water in one fluid motion, mud cascading from his uniform. Before the sniper could turn, George fired. One shot, point blank to center mass. The man crumpled instantly. George worked the bolt, swung the rifle, and shot the second soldier before he could raise his weapon. 2 kills. Silent, efficient, deadly. The last sniper had come looking for him, and George had been waiting. The gunshots echoed through the groves, 2 sharp cracks that carried far beyond the banyans. George knew the sound would draw attention. He just didn't expect it to happen so fast. At 10:28 a.m., he heard it. Voices, more than 2, close. Branches snapped under boots. Metal rattled. 6 Japanese infantrymen moved toward the bodies George had just dropped, drawn by the gunfire, searching for the source. George slid back into the crater, sinking into the cold mud until only his eyes and the top of his head broke the surface. He raised the Winchester straight up again, keeping water out of the barrel. His heartbeat slowed. His breathing quieted. He became part of the earth. The first soldier reached the crater rim. He looked down. Their eyes met, George's hidden in the water, the soldiers widening in surprise. George fired from beneath the surface. The soldier jerked backward and fell. Shouts erupted instantly, urgent, panicked Japanese commands. 2 more soldiers rushed to the rim, rifles coming up. George worked the bolt underwater, rose halfway, and fired again. 1 dropped. He chambered another round. The 3rd soldier fired wildly as he died, his shot cracking past George's ear. 3 soldiers down, 3 still moving. Bullets ripped across the crater, chewing mud and spraying shards of earth into the air. George rolled out the opposite side, boots slipping in the muck, lungs burning. He ran, through ferns, through jagged roots, through narrow trenches carved by weeks of rain. Rifle fire chased him. Sharp cracks, splintering wood, snapping vines. The Japanese weren't firing to hit him. They were firing to pin him, to slow him down long enough to catch him in the open. George zigzagged through the grove, chest heaving, mud drying on his uniform as he pushed deeper into cover. 90 seconds of sprinting felt like miles. Finally, the gunfire faded behind him. The shouting grew distant. He slowed his pace only when he neared the American perimeter, hands trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion. A Marine sentry raised his rifle until George shouted his name. Then, silence. George checked his Winchester, mud on the stock, water dripping from the barrel. He opened the bolt. 2 rounds remained. 2. He had entered the groves alone, with 60 rounds and a rifle no one believed in. Now, after killing 11 snipers and surviving an infantry chase, he walked back into American lines alive. When George finally stepped back into American lines, soaked and exhausted, he expected a reprimand, maybe even a lecture about wandering off alone with a bolt-action rifle. Instead, he was summoned to regimental headquarters. Waiting for him was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander, a man known more for blunt honesty than flattery. He didn't waste time with introductions. He simply asked, "Can you teach other men to do what you just did?" George hesitated. Teaching was different from shooting, but the colonel wasn't joking. The division had recovered 14 Springfield rifles, each fitted with heavy unertl scopes, Marine sniper rifles left behind during the early fighting, and the regiment still had 40 men who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. Ferry wanted George to build something new, something the US Army didn't formally have yet: a dedicated sniper section. George agreed, under one condition: he would keep his Winchester. The colonel approved it on the spot. Training began on January 27th, just miles from Henderson Field. George taught breathing control, trigger discipline, reading wind, using terrain for support. He taught them how to move unseen, how to wait for hours, how to shoot once and relocate before the enemy could find them. By the end of the 3rd day, 32 of the 40 men could hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George split them into 2-man teams, shooter and spotter, so no one operated alone the way he had been forced to. Then they deployed. For 12 days, the sniper section moved west, clearing Japanese stragglers and rearguard positions. Their results were staggering: 74 confirmed kills, 0 American casualties during sniper operations. The battalion had never moved so confidently. And though no one realized it at the time, the US Army's modern sniper doctrine, The idea of trained teams, precision marksmanship, independent operations quietly began in those 12 days. In a jungle grove on Guadalcanal, with a mail-order rifle, George's war should have ended on Guadalcanal, but men like him, men who could change a battlefield with a single shot, didn't stay idle for long. In early 1944, orders came down from Pacific Command. Combat-experienced officers were needed for a new, long-range penetration unit forming in India, a unit that would operate deep behind Japanese lines in the harshest jungle on Earth. Merrill's Marauders. George volunteered. Before deployment, he stripped down his Winchester for the terrain ahead. The heavy Lyman Alaskan scope came off, replaced with a lighter Weaver 330. He swapped the wooden stock for a synthetic one, shaving precious ounces. It wasn't vanity, it was survival. Burma wasn't a battlefield, it was a punishment. Heat that crushed the lungs, jungle so dense it swallowed sunlight, leeches, monsoons, cliffs, rivers, and trails that weren't really trails at all. The Marauders marched more than 700 miles on foot, climbing ridges, hacking through bamboo forests, and moving for weeks without proper resupply. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria spread faster than gunfire. By May, disease claimed more marauders than Japanese bullets ever did. But in the chaos, George's rifle still found purpose. 3 times during the march, a distant target threatened to pin down his platoon. 3 times, George set the Winchester against a tree root or rock, steadied his breath, and fired only once. A Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing, dead at over 400 yards. A machine gunner suppressing a patrol, dropped with a single shot. A sniper hidden in the foliage, eliminated before he could fire again. Each time George relocated instantly, fading back into the jungle before the enemy could pinpoint him. But as the miles wore on, he sensed something shifting. Modern warfare was changing, growing faster, louder, more mechanized. The quiet skill of a lone marksman with a handcrafted rifle felt like a relic of an older world. Still, in the nightmare of Burma, his Winchester saved lives. One more time. Today, the Winchester Model 70 that John George carried through Guadalcanal and Burma sits quietly inside a glass display case at the National Firearms Museum in Virginia. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. To them, it looks like any other vintage hunting rifle. Polished wood, simple lines, nothing unusual. But that rifle is anything but ordinary. It dropped 11 Japanese snipers in 4 days, broke a stalemate that cost American lives, and forced commanders to rethink how precision shooting could shape modern warfare. It helped spark the first informal sniper doctrine in the US Army, and it proved once and for all that skill matters more than perfect equipment. A mail-order rifle, carried by a man the Army underestimated, changed the course of an entire battlefield. If this story moved you, even a little, like this video so more people can hear it. Every single click tells YouTube this history is worth saving. And if you enjoy true stories of forgotten heroism, subscribe so you never miss the next one. Before you go, drop a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. Your comment keeps these memories alive, and you're part of honoring men like John George, soldiers who deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching.